Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Monday. You're with the Rabbinic Cynic, Rabbi Andrew. It's wiping the cobwebs from the weekend time. I went for a walk at 5:30 this morning. I was listening to BBC World Service, and Her Majesty was being laid to rest. It's kind of interesting coming in America. I actually found it on the New York Times, and then wanted to listen to the BBC. Listen to the BBC World Service and BBC Radio 5, and you get kind of that nostalgia from when I was growing up. It was interesting. As the last thing, I kind of talking about the Queen and everything that she meant to the British people. I talked about it last week extensively, but just today, my heart goes out to my British family and friends and people in England. I know it's a difficult time of uncertainty. What's going to happen? We got all the soap operas surrounding it with Harry and Meghan. I noticed Harry wasn't in uniform, which I thought was kind of strange. Shouldn't he be in uniform? I mean, he served in combat, right? He served in combat, but he wasn't in uniform. They said he was going to be. There were rumors, but nope, he just wore all his war medals. But those who weren't in combat were wearing their uniforms. Seems kind of strange considering how much Harry is loved by many in the military based on his own personal service. Because he's the spare. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the royal family. May flights of angels lead you to rest, Your Majesty. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Today I want to talk about, I'm continuing with my themes. I go through these themes, right? Rabbi Sachs has a Pathways to God series, and it's 10 different pathways, and it discusses each different. I kind of go through each different aspect of it. Sometimes I'll talk about Israel, sometimes I'll talk about Jewish identity. Science and religion is a big one. I kind of want to touch on that today. And if you notice, my title is What's in a Name? What is in a name? This can be found in the module that actually discusses science and religion. So the question is, why are the names of God, and there's specifically two names of God, even though in the Talmud they actually talk about there are 72 names of God, and each one represents a different anthropomorphic, right? Anthropomorphic meaning how we relate as human beings to that which we cannot understand. So we use these names of God. But in general, there are two names of God that is used in the Torah, right? So we just think of the word God has a connotation. It's an English word. Doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. Judaism has a whole different approach to that, and we see repeatedly mentioned mostly two specific names. One is Adonai, which is considered the Tetragrammaton, which is in Hebrew it's Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, and commonly pronounced Yovah. There's no real, we don't have the tradition to understand how to actually pronounce that name correctly. And then traditionally Jews don't say, observant or traditional Jews don't often say that the name that we know as Adonai, which really just means Sir or Lord, but rather they use the word Hashem, which means the name, which actually has kind of more of a powerful meaning if you think about it. Hashem meaning the name. So that's one of the names of God. The other name of God, which we see used even more so in a general sense, is the name Elohim. Or if you're Orthodox, you would say Elohim because you don't pronounce the name of God. And Elohim is actually is a word in the plural, right? So it's almost a they, which is ironic if you consider the idea of how can God be plural when we believe in one God? Well, it's not a plural God. I think it's more of it's an identity of what is the personal. So the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean? Why are there two different names of God, and what do we learn from these two different names of God? So the first one, Elohim, is also a word that is used to refer to judges, but it's also it's more of a universalistic word when referring to God. Examples where the word Elohim are used is, for example, Elohim is the God that spoke to Noah, that told Noah to go out save all of the animals. Another King Abimelech appeals. So it's the God Elohim that appears to him, not necessarily the God of the God that we understand. And so you see that throughout the different thing. Who was Pharaoh referring to? Also the same, Elohim. So whenever we see the word Elohim, we're looking at this name of God, El, right? Those of you like Superman, right? Jor-El. So there's those allusions to God. Hollywood loves to do that, right? Maybe it's because there's so many Jewish people who write for Hollywood back at the time. I know it's become much broader, thankfully, right? Much more diverse. But El's made its way into law as this general idea of something that is powerful, something that is beyond our reach, something that is beyond understanding. And so that's why it's included in this idea of what is the differences between science and religion, because science really just explains how things happen, but they don't really understand why things happen. So when we make these references to things we don't understand, so in the ancient Bible, they use this word Elohim, right, to refer to God, in the sense of the God of history, the God of community, the God of nations, right, the God that or time itself, the universe itself. That's that idea of Elohim, the multiple different iterations, the multiple different ways we can examine the universal names of that which was created, the universal idea of how creation came to existence. Now, it could be from a singularity that came into existence. The idea of one God is that idea of a singularity, that there is one single element that was the source of creation, and how we understand it. So religion is trying to kind of explain that in the why. So in the why aspect of it, so we know the world began with the Big Bang. We know it began with all these elements coming together, and then gravity, and then the planets were formed out of dust, out of stardust, literally, right? That's a famous quote if you study astrology, right? We're all in the end, we're all stardust, right? And that's the idea, right? I'm gonna stop saying right. I don't know why I do that. I started doing it last week, and I'm stopping it. Okay, I'm gonna say okay. But we are all stardust, and that's, if you study astronomy, we understand we are all stardust. So stardust is this kind of universal idea of understanding it, and the Bible itself uses that as a way to refer to God in terms of the word Elohim. Things change slightly, though, when we start talking about the other name of God, Adonai, or Elohim, Adonai, or as we say, Hashem. The other Abrahamic religions, for example, Christianity, Jehovah is that kind of translation. So Adonai represents a much more personal, the Hashem, I should say, the name, which is just four letters, Yud, He, Vav, He, or if you're reading Hebrew, Yud, He, Vav, He. Really, actually, when you talk about Kabbalah, it's a much more personal reference to God. For example, in the book of Leviticus, the word Adonai appears far more times than the word Elohim, because it's talking about our personal relationship with the divine. And each of us have this, and that's what the High Holidays is all about, is reconciling the universal with the personal, right? So we have the universal idea, right? We want to look for atonement for the community as a whole, but we also want to have that kind of understanding of our own internal process. And that's that internal personal relationship that we may have with a higher power, we may have with God, we may call it science, we may call it nature, we may call it whatever you want to call it, but we still can have that personal relationship with her. We're unique. And that's the idea. I talked about this last week a little bit. That's the idea of looking at the divine image in every human being. So it's not just that we see the divine in a human being, but we recognize that every human being has that uniqueness, that unique relationship with eternity, that our impact on eternity is on a personal level as much as a community, our impact on society has it on a grander scale. But from a personal level, right, we cry out from the depths of our souls, the depths of our beings when we're in distress, or when we're happy, when we're in love, when we're in joyous occasions. That's when we bring and we call on the name of Adonai. We call on the name of Hashem, the name of our personal God, the personal God that we believe helps guide us through our lives, helps guide us through difficult times. And that's the name what we say when we say the most powerful prayer in Judaism says it's the word Adonai is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu, right? So Adonai is our God, right? So it's the name there, and it's repeated again, right? Adonai Echad, the name is one. Adonai Hashem, the name is one. We are one because we're talking about that personal relationship. And then that personal relationship, then the next paragraph itself talks about love, right? Loving v'ahavta, and you shall love God. Maybe that also means you shall love yourself. And I think that's a very difficult thing to understand, right? A lot of mental illness is caused by that kind of the self-deprecation, the lack of understanding of loving ourselves. That's how it relates to us personally, right? So when we can see that in that, we can have that personal relationship, look at the sunrise and say, this is my personal relationship with the divine, with the universe, with creation. That takes us to a different level than when we just kind of look at God just kind of sitting out there, right? The traditional image of an old dude on a throne. But that's not really what that means. Elohim just kind of means the universe as a whole. You look up and you see these multiple galaxies everywhere, right? That could be Elohim, right? That could be the multitude that is creation, the infinity, the speck of dust that we are. It's very hard for us to understand. And so we see in that generalized sense the way the Torah, the way the 5 books of Moses discusses that, and it specifically talks about it with historical leaders. But then you get into the personal, right? The personal trials of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They start talking about that personal relationship they have, of their trying to understand their place in the world. And that's really what these two names represent, right? The place that we have in the world as a human, as an individual, and that's Adonai, that's Hashem, the name. And the place that we have, and the reason for the place that we have, as a we, as a collective we, right? So I was talking about the Queen's funeral today. That would be an example of the collective we, the peculiarity of the British public and their devotion to that monarch, to the monarch Queen Elizabeth II, or that powerful influence, right? That's a we. That's Elohim. That's the people coming together, and everyone as individuals may have their own relationship and their own responses. Some may not even care. Oh, that's the end of the monarchy. We don't need it anymore. It's the 21st century, right? Sure, I can agree with that argument. A lot of people have been asking me, what do I think about it? I think, well, for me personally, again, Adonai, I'm thinking about my own personal relationship with an understanding of a human life, which is the Queen. The Queen is just a century human, right? She wasn't going to live forever. We all knew that. Even though and when I was listening to the BBC today, I was like, people were like, well, we all thought she was never going to die, but of course she's going to die. She's a human being. She had her own personal relationship as well, right? We imagine kings and queens and prime ministers and presidents and leaders, right? So they are on the grandest scheme. They have a much more powerful influence on the world than that we do, but they're also individuals in the same sense. And so so when we talk about science and the creation of the world, or science in the social sciences, or whatever science you want to talk about, you have that kind of macro view of everything. And that's what the word Elohim means. And that would be, for example, the mourning of the British people in general, or the mourning that we have when we see a great leader, American leader, die, or a great leader, any other great leader of the world, or an impactful historical event. So we see that from a communal level. But then psychologically speaking, we then have our own personal reaction or reflection on that. And that's represented in the name Hashem, that very own personal, our own personal reaction to history, to life's events, to our own personal events. And mostly it's about our own personal events, because we are living in our own little personal bubbles. And so the idea is that we have to recognize that we go from the universal of Elohim to the personal of Adonai. So the universal of that name of God to the personal of who we are as who we are as individuals. And that is the powerful image, and that's what Abrahamic monotheism brought to the world, was the power of the individual as represented in that divine name. The divine name Yud He Vav He, the four-letter name of God, called the Tetragrammaton because it has some Kabbalistic connotations in terms of our connection to the universe. And that's something I want to. That's too long to discuss in this podcast. I promise you, I will discuss it. I got even diagrams and stuff to show you. It's really, really kind of confusing, but simple at the same time. How do we understand that personal connection, that we can be directly connected? And that's something to do with, our consciousness, who we are as individuals, and it's unique to every individual. And so that's what I would like to say about that was my teaching for today, and I thought it was appropriate in terms of going from the universal to the particular. Right, that's the theme, right? The universal of, and especially in the light of this universal mass mourning that the United Kingdom's having right now, and then you go down to the personal. And one last statement on that was I heard a commentator on the BBC was saying, which might be sad for Prince Charles, that this was kind of the last time London will be seen as the capital of the world. Probably it was once for a day. The British Empire is not what it was, but for that one day, we saw everybody come together from all around the world to pay tribute to Her Majesty the Queen, blessed memory. So I'd like to now move on to something a little lighter. We're talking about monarchy. We've been talking about names. We've been talking, and now we're going to be talking about another name, the House of Dragon, the House of Targaryen, right? Game of Thrones was on yesterday. It was not quite as shocking as it was last week, where we saw some interesting issues brought up. But it did bring some interesting issues up this week. This is a spoiler alert if you haven't seen it yet. And that is the issue of marriage, right? Royal marriages, right? Very appropriate kind of when we're gossiping about Harry and Meghan, right? William and Kate and all, King Charles and Camilla, right? All of that stuff. Right, so you see that brought out in Game of Thrones, but what's more interesting is the sexism that you see, right? She's the queen, she is the queen to be, and her future husband was considered the queen consort, which is very similar. You can see that parallel. It wasn't, obviously it was recorded before the queen died, so it had nothing to do with it, I'm sure. But what you do see, which I think is powerful, which I thought was interesting, was how they had to make this kind of agreement behind the scenes, because he turned out to be gay, the person she was marrying, and she had her own, she loved somebody else. And it just did not end well for either of them, for either of the people, because they were just like kind of used up, the idea that a monarch in this sense has to marry who they're supposed to marry. This seems to be a problem that has been, that was the problem of Prince Charles. He was told he had to marry Princess Diana, and look how that turned out. He should have just been told in the first place, marry whoever you want. And again, that's the problem with Harry and Meghan, right? They married who they wanted, but it didn't turn out that well. The racism that might have been inherent because Meghan's American and of color, that was a real issue. It wasn't something that they just made up. It was a real issue. And Game of Thrones, I thought, did an excellent job of kind of showing the frailty of monarchy, the frailty of leadership. Even, someone, Rhaenyra, she's a real strong woman, would be a strong queen. But, if you read all of the spoilers, because it's all out there on the internet, because it's all written in the book, you see that things don't end well. It always ends in civil war, right? This competitiveness between different political houses, right? Political parties that just never ends well. And I believe that's a kind of an important point that Game of Thrones kind of makes. Game of Thrones, that even though it's a medieval type fictional world with dragons, it has a lot of resonance to modern politics, even though it's a kind of medieval politics. You could translate, people getting beaten to death in court to something quite different, that's a day that plays itself out in the media. And so I think Game of Thrones does that really well. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other shows that I like to watch, Doctor Who and She-Hulk and Rings of Power, which I know people hate on quite a big level. But that's for another time. Today is a week before Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish high holidays, and so I am going to blow the shofar. This is the week we say the weeks of Slichot. We make these prayers of personal forgiveness, again, our personal relationship with God, but at the same time, I'm just going to blow the shofar because I think it's a really cool instrument, that's all. So I'm going to say the Tekiah and send you on your work week, the beginning of the work week. But if it's not, maybe this is your weekend. For those in the service industry, Monday is so happy weekend if you're in the service industry. Tekiah. Everybody have a beautiful week. Live long and prosper. And if you want to watch the BBC, listen to the BBC, you can watch the Queen's final farewell as she is laid to rest at Windsor Palace. Live long and prosper. And everybody have a beautiful week. Bye.